Today is January 26, 2003, and we are at the Kent County Veterans Service Building in Grand Rapids, Michigan, conducting a Veterans History interview with Fred Youngs, who served in the U.S. Army. Fred's full name is Frederick Vern Youngs, date of birth 4/19/1955. And my name is Wallace Erickson, and I'm a volunteer interviewer with the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan. And this interview is being conducted under the auspices of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. Fred, let me ask you, can you give me your full name and date of birth?
Frederick Vern Youngs, April 19th, 1955.
Thank you. Fred, where were you born, and where did you live initially?
Born in Cadillac, Michigan. When I was 3 years old, Mom and Dad moved to Grand Rapids. He was a truck driver, so we lived in Petoskey, Sparta, a couple places in Grand Rapids. Wound up living on Ray Street on the northeast side, not too far from this building. And that was, I was in the 4th grade or so. Went to St. Isidore's school, went to West Catholic High School, enlisted in the Army right out of high school. In fact, I was February before I graduated. I went to Detroit and enlisted. My mother was a little upset because I didn't tell her I was enlisting.
When was that? What date do you remember that you signed up?
That was February 23rd, 1974.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you go to boot camp right away?
No, I was what they call delayed entry. I went to basic training July 17th, 1974. Now, anybody that knows history, the Vietnam War was going on when I enlisted in February, and it basically ended. The peace treaty was signed on April 1974. So I didn't have to worry about going to Vietnam. I was what they called back then a Cold War warrior. So yeah.
Where did you go to basic training?
I went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
To basic training, I was in Delta 3-2 basic training company. Was there, like I say, July 17th through to, I think we graduated in something like September. Went to my AIT, which is your Advanced Individual Training for your job. I was a mechanic, a wheeled vehicle mechanic. Did my schooling right there at Fort Leonard Wood. For those that don't know, that was back in the day and still is today, the home of the engineers. And I went from there in November 1974 to Fort Leonard Wood, to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And
let me just ask you before we go too far, why did you join the Army?
Well,
since you weren't going to get drafted.
This will be a short, hopefully I can keep this short. I had a cousin, and back in the 50s, he had robbed a bank. Old Camp Bank, which is now owned by another conglomerate. And he went before the judge, and there was a guy in military uniform sitting in the audience. And the judge looked at my cousin and said, "Young man, you got a choice. I can send you to prison, or you can join the Army, and that guy right behind you will take you." This was during the Korean War. My cousin retired after going to Korea, did 3 tours in Vietnam, and retired in the late 70s. I don't know the exact date, but he retired a Master Sergeant out of the Army. So the Army did him very well instead of winding up, gosh knows where he would have gone had he have gone to prison.
And you had a good example from your cousin.
And I had a very good example. Yeah. My senior year in high school, we'd gone down to visit him, and all of his buddies were welcoming him back from Vietnam and so on, and I felt that kinship, and so I enlisted in the Army, mainly because of him, and I made a career out of it.
Do you remember your first day, or first days, I should say, in basic training? What were they like?
Well, I had hair down to here, which down to my shoulders. That was the hairy days of you know, the 70s. Yeah. And we got to Fort Leonard Wood, dark 30 in the morning. Sometime after 1 o'clock is all I remember. They yelled at us, and we did all kinds of crazy things, and we managed to get a couple hours sleep. The next morning, they shaved my head. And I had seen one guy, he had told the barber, just take a little bit of a trim off. And the barber did just that. He took a little bit of hair off, and the guy got to the back, and the drill sergeant said, pay the man $7. Got to the back of the line, he said, now you're getting a haircut my way. So I knew, you know, I said, just cut it all off, and they did. Takes them about 2 seconds to do a haircut. Because I got hundreds of kids going through every day. So them barbers are used to that, but yeah. Never forget that.
And how long was your basic training?
It was 8 weeks. Yep.
And then you went to AIT, Advanced Individual Training?
Yes, went to AIT, and that was 10 weeks. There at Fort Leonard Wood, on the back part of the post. They taught us how to be mechanics in 10 weeks.
Did you make any lasting friendships with those that you went through basic training with, or even AIT? Or?
I think about them all the time, but I didn't. I lost track of them. And one of the kids, his father was the National Guard Army commander for the state of Nebraska. And his dad was mad that he was going in the Army as a private, not going to OCS. So it was kind of funny, you know. I think about him once in a while and wonder, you know, how did you, you know, did you become an officer, or did you stay a private, or what'd you do, you know? But yeah, I lost track of all them guys.
I see. Where were you assigned after AIT? Did you stay at Fort Leonard Wood?
No. I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was assigned to Service Battery, 1st of the 73rd Field Artillery. Was 155 towed. I loved it. It was a great unit. Me turning wrenches, went to the motor pool and worked, and we did a lot of training going to the field and stuff.
Did you work mainly on the trucks, or also on the artillery pieces, the towed howitzers?
My particular job was just on the trucks.
I see.
Everything was trucks.
So the artillery people with artillery MOS would have handled everything to do with the artillery?
Occasionally, if we were when we were out in the field doing field maneuvers, if they needed extra hands, I would wind up, because I was in Service Battery, we handed out all the ammunition to the line batteries. So I wound up humping 155 rounds to the line units every now and again.
Okay, you're at Fort Bragg then with an artillery unit. What sort of artillery pieces, howitzers, did they have there?
They had 155 towed, which you hook it up just like a trailer to the back of a 5-ton cargo truck and take it out to the field. And you know, the truck you could carry the ammunition in, and as well as the troops, and take the the gun behind it and do as what they called it, shoot, move, and communicate. So, yeah, it was.
How long did you spend at Fort Bragg?
I was there about 3 years
I see.
before I re-enlisted, and I re-enlisted to go overseas to Germany. And
What base did you go to in Germany?
I went to I guess you want to call it southeast Germany, to a city called Karlsruhe, which is between Heidelberg and Stuttgart in Germany, to a Kaserne, which is a camp. They're smaller than big army bases, called a Kaserne. It was called Smiley Barracks. An engineer brigade headquarters had personnel, finance, CID, MPs, and a medical. And that was about it that was on that particular base. And our brigade had 5 battalions spread out across Germany.
And you were still, your MOS was still truck maintenance, was that right?
Yes, it was. Yep.
I see.
Yep.
Okay. Did you operate with the German military too, or in training or anything there?
We did some with the Germans as well as the French. And worked with them, shot with them, and also shot with the local police. Germany, it's called the Polizei. We shot with them because the Rod and Gun Club, which is just like a gun club here in the States, was better than their facility they had, and they liked our facility better. So we wound up on Saturday shooting with them.
And how long were you there in Karlsruhe then?
I was there about 6 years. And during that time, I had gone from assistant motor sergeant to brigade headquarters, working S4 maintenance as a tech inspector on all the wheeled vehicles. And in that, we would go around we were a combat engineer construction unit. And in Germany, back in the 70s and 80s, was called the Cold War, and our enemies were the Russians. And we were always worried they were going to come across the old East German, West German border. And so all the construction that happened on a lot of the bases, especially the Air Force, they did not like hiring local contractors because they couldn't vet them well enough. So we did a lot of work on the Air Force bases. So consequently, my job, especially from April to November, if you're familiar with construction, that's when all of our contractors like to do construction work because it's cold and snowy. And I would go out and make sure the equipment was being kept up to operational standards so that it could do its job throughout the year without holding up the project, because you had a short period of time to do the work.
Yeah. Were you married at the time when you were in Karlsruhe?
I got married the last year and a half that I was in Germany. I met a girl that was in one of our subordinate battalions, and it was kind of funny because she was a Spec 4, I was an E5, promotable, and all of the people in my command and her command knew that we were dating, and when I would come to inspect, they would tell her, hey, be good to Fred, and she says, well, that don't matter, he's not, and my commander, the brigade commander, I had to go to a staff meeting of all the battalion commanders and him and tell them that I would not hold anything against or for any of the units because my girlfriend at that time was a part of one of the units. My wife wound up getting out of the Army, and she worked for the brigade staff as a civilian. Yes, she was a GS4. So, yep.
So obviously you had an accompanied tour there. She was able to stay in.
At the end, yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Was what we called a company tour. Correct.
Where did you transfer to after Carlsruhe?
I went back to Fort Bragg. I did not have an assigned unit. One of the battalions, as I said, one of the master sergeants said, "Hey, you know, if you ever hit Fort Bragg again, look me up." And he was an old airborne troop, and I looked him up. And he asked me where I wanted to go, and he said, "You want to go to the 20th Engineers or where?" And I said, "Nah, I want something, you know, whatever, nice." Well, he took me to the 1st Corps Support Command, and I met the Sergeant Major. Sergeant Major looked up and seen that I was a promotable E5, which I made E6 6 months after I arrived at my unit that he assigned me to, which was the 14th DPD, Data Processing Detachment, which does not exist anymore in the military. We had all of the computers for the Army on the entire East Coast. So anything that was done on a computer was done in my unit. That building was entirely classified. It had MPs at the doors. You had to have a security clearance to go in that building. Now today, 2023, that was 1982, 83, I think, 84, somewhere in there. And you had these huge computers, and now, you know, we got everything on laptops. By the time somebody reads this in the future, you know, you might have something smaller than that even, you know, who knows. But it was interesting to have a security clearance just to go in this building. And that was why I got that job. I had a security clearance, and it was very rewarding. We passed all of our inspections for the first time ever that unit had been in existence. And they'd been in existence only about 5 years at that time. So it was interesting.
Did your wife stay in the military then, when
Nope.
you were back here in the States?
No, sir. She stayed a civilian. We got to Fort Bragg. My daughter was born in Germany. Brought her back. My wife got pregnant shortly afterwards with my son. He was born there at Fort Bragg, Womack Army Hospital. And no, she got out. She became a civilian. And then we kind of moved on from there.
How many years were you at Fort Bragg on your second tour there?
I was there about 2.5 years,
I see.
3 years. And I was coming up on enlistment, and the wife said she wanted out of Fort Bragg. Well, I tried to go back to Germany. They said no, and I said, well, I'll go anywhere on the West Coast. I didn't care if it was Colorado, whether it was Washington or California, wherever there was an Army base. And they said, no, you're going to stay here at Fort Bragg. And I told the wife that, and she said, well, then I'm going home to my mom or your mom's, or you're getting out. And so...
Was your wife from Grand Rapids too, or?
No, my wife was from Northern California, a little town at that time called Chico. Anybody that knows football,
Chico State, right?
Chico State, and Aaron Rodgers from the Green Bay Packers was from Chico, California. And my daughter, had we have stayed in California, she went to some of the schools he did. He was, in fact, at one of the other grade schools, but not hers. She would have gone to high school with him. Mm-hmm. So that was, I guess you could say, our claim to fame.
When did you leave Fort Bragg, and where did you go?
I left there, that would have been about 86. Me and the wife, I decided to leave the active Army, came home. I enlisted in the National Guard. When I went to I wanted to go to reserves. There was only one reserve unit. They didn't have a spot for me. So I went to the National Guard.
That was here in Grand Rapids?
Here in Grand Rapids.
It's the Grand Valley Armory?
Yep. And they were standing up a engineer unit, brand new unit, down at Fort Custer, down in Battle Creek. And myself and 6 guys, we stood up that unit. Our first unit, our first meet was 6 guys, myself, and 5 other guys, including the commander. And we didn't even have equipment, uniforms, nothing.
Now, were you active duty at that time, or?
No, I was Army National Guard, a weekend warrior.
Weekend warrior. Okay, guardsman, typical, traditional guardsman.
Yep. I did that until '89, and we decided to move to California. Went to California, to Chico, where my wife was from, and I went into the 132nd Engineers there in Chico. And after I was there, year, 2 years, trying to remember the dates, Desert Storm happened. And I had volunteered to go active duty. They didn't take me. And I wound up going with a unit that, after a term, fast forward a little bit, Desert Storm was over with, everybody was coming home. A lot of units got deactivated in Iraq. They left their equipment right there. Well, the Army tried to figure out what they were going to do with all this equipment that was left behind. It was millions of dollars worth. So we loaded it up on ships and shipped it to 3 ports. One in California, one in Texas, one on the East Coast. And we repaired all that equipment, brought it back up to military standards, and it was issued out to National Guard units across the United States. And I was a full-time National Guard soldier, working at Camp Roberts, California. Did that for 17 months. Very enjoyable to see the fruits of a broken truck and bringing it to a fully operational truck, loading it on railhead, loading it on trucks, and shipping it to units across the United States. That was very rewarding to us. And during that time frame, a little bit of history here, the Rodney King riots happened.
Los Angeles, right?
Yes, in Los Angeles. And my unit out of Chico was activated and sent to LA. I had gone home for the weekend. I called my bosses up and I said, what do I do? And I was informed I had to go with my unit to LA. They put us on airplanes and flew us in C-130s down to LA. Within 2 days, my company and an infantry company were living in a LA County boxing gymnasium. The police, the sheriff's department, had what they called boxing gymnasiums. And it was a place to get the kids off the street. Mm-hmm. It had 3 showers for 300 guys. We were there for a month, patrolling the streets after the riots. That was very rewarding. They were building a new jail just outside of Compton, California, which is a suburb, lots of suburbs in LA. And we guarded the jail also. They were afraid they were going to burn the new jail down. Once my time was up, I went back there to Camp Roberts, did my job, went back home to Chico and got a phone call from my old boss back in Michigan. And he said, "What are you doing, Fred?" I said, "Well, I'm not doing much." He says, "Well, I need you." And he was offering me a real good wage. So me and the wife,
This is a civilian position?
yes,
then?
this was a civilian position
May I ask you where it was?
here in Grand Rapids. So I told the wife, and I said, the kids were going to year-round school at the time. So I came back via railroad, Amtrak, came home, and the following July, the wife met up with me. She packed the house up and moved back here. And as soon as I got back here, I transferred to my old engineer unit. I stayed with that unit until 1998.
What civilian company? What was your employer?
It was Freightliner of Grand Rapids, Freightliner trucks. I worked in the parts department. I was what we called the back counter man. I worked mainly with the mechanics, second shift, 3 to 11, or sometimes trucks had to be done. It was 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And that went right along with my civilian or my military job as a mechanic. And I got promoted throughout all those times, went to different military schools, became a Sergeant First Class E7, as you've seen my hat earlier. And I had 24 years in the Army total by the time I was all done there. And I thought, you know, it's time for me to retire. And I did. I retired. That was in 1998.
So you had enough time then between active duty and your reserve or guard
Yep.
duty
Yes, sir.
to have
Yep.
your 20-year retirement,
Correct.
is that right?
And got to remember, National Guard is part-time soldiers, so you only accumulate, and the Army works on a point system, just like the Marine Corps or the Air Force or the Navy, reserves and such forth. In that point system, you only get so many points a year unless you do active duty time. And me doing a lot of those active duty times, it helped. I still had, I had like 12 years when I left active duty the first time, went reserves, and worked. So I had 20 years, and I retired, stayed working at Freightliner until late 2005. My wife got a phone call, landline. This was the beginning of cell phones. And my wife talked to this individual, and after she was done, she called me and she said, "Fred, there's going to be a guy, Major so-and-so, I don't remember his name, from the Army Reserves out of St. Louis, Missouri." I was being ordered back to active duty from retirement. Not many people realize this, but when you retire, you are sort of subject to being recalled during wartime. Well, now we're into Operation Iraqi Freedom, or we're battling Iraq and Afghanistan. And I talked to this major, and I was being ordered back to active duty. I wanted to go to Afghanistan, but no, I didn't. They sent me to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Maryland. I was going to be an instructor. Now it's 2006. I had to go through a mini basic training, a quick physical and all that good stuff. They taught me to be an instructor. And I lived in the BEQ, billeting for enlisted quarters.
So your wife didn't join you in Aberdeen?
No, I went there as a single soldier. She drew, all the money and everything. thank goodness for debit cards. So she'd leave money for me in the bank. I was a instructor for the Automotive Artillery Recovery Department, which is wheeled vehicles as well as armored vehicles, to recover those if they've been damaged in war, caught in the mud, whatever, snowstorms, whatever needs to be done. That was our job. And we trained soldiers on that fresh out of their AIT. We trained Army soldiers. We trained Marine soldiers also on that. I didn't have very many, and we trained male and female. I was there doing my job, went into work one morning, and I got there early because I only lived across the street. And at that time, my boss, another E7, said, "Sergeant, you're going to be, you are the new NCOIC, non-commissioned officer in charge." I said, no, I don't need that job. I said, I'm retired. I says, I'm not going to get promoted. And he says, yep, I'm going to OCS, and the boss says you're going to get, you got the job. And I worked for two warrant officers, a CW4 and a CW5. So that was fine. And the warrant officer, the CW5, drugged me to all of the meetings. Aberdeen Proving Grounds is the headquarters for what the Army calls the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. The Army has their armor, infantry, and so on and so forth, you know, the different branches. And I was the Ordnance Corps. That's what mechanics are. So in that, you get to sit on the meetings with all the generals and colonels and so on and so forth. And we had lots of old World War II equipment around. And the general was always asking us to move this stuff for her. And we did. Another day, I go in, I'm getting ready to leave work. It's 5:30, 6 o'clock. I didn't have to leave. I always got my work done because I'm always being interrupted during the day, so I did a lot of stuff after everybody was gone. And the warrants, I walked in and said, hey, I'm going home, see you tomorrow. And the warrants looked at me and said, tomorrow morning's Class A uniform. I said, oh, there's nothing on the training schedule for dress uniform. You're going to the Pentagon with me tomorrow morning. And I said, oh, no, they don't allow E7s at the Pentagon, and we all laughed. And I said, so why am I going to the Pentagon? And the CW4, his job, besides what he did in the office and whatnot, was he was the lead for the Ordnance Corps moving to Fort Lee, Virginia. So he had to brief the general staff on where we stood, because this project had gone millions over budget. And I said, so why is this young E7? And I laughed because I was 50 years old at the time. And they said, well, you're show and tell. I said, none of these generals are going to realize that we're doing retiree recalls. So I walked in and I had my hash marks, you know, from here to here, you know, and they're all looking at me, you know, and who's this old gray-haired, you know, E7 standing here, you know. Chief started, well, my mustache was regulation then. This is nowhere close to regulation. I wished I could do that, but the generals asked, you know, the warrant officer introduced me and said, Sergeant Youngs is a retiree recall. Now what? They're recalling retired guys? What's going on? And then I told him when I was at Fort Jackson doing my in-processing back into the Army, there was myself, another E7 who came with me to Aberdeen, a captain, I don't know where the captain went, he was kind of a jerk. and a lieutenant colonel who happened to be a friend of oh, name escapes me. He was the general that ran Desert Storm and Norman. He went to West Point with Storm and Norman. But the colonel was really a good guy, and he drove us all over. But the colonels, the generals, were just amazed that this is going on. I did that there at Aberdeen for 2 years. Loved the job. And my time was coming up, and I got a phone call one day. Hey, we want to make you a recruiter. I said, nope, I hate recruiters. And I didn't have really anything against them. But they talked me into it. And I was able to pick where I wanted to go, sort of, kind of, as long as there was a slot open. Me being from Grand Rapids, I kind of kept going farther out from Grand Rapids. And it was going towards Detroit, and he was trying to send me to Detroit. And I said, I do not want to go to Detroit. And I said, well, what do you got in the UP? I said, you got something in Marquette? And they said, yes. So I became, at 52 years old, I was the U.S. Army / Army Reserve recruiter for Marquette. As a reserve recruiter, I could recruit anywhere in the UP. As an Army recruiter, I only had my certain area around Marquette, which actually was quite large. If anybody knows Marquette, it's not very populated. Back then it was 100,000 people, counting all the cats and horses and dogs. So I did that. And I did very well at it.
You were active duty at this point still?
I was active duty now, again.
Still recall
Yes,
active duty?
yes. I wound up 27 years playing Army. Between National Guard, Reserve, active Army, I did 27 years. Yeah, there was times I hated it.
Now, your recalled time then, Fred, recalled active duty, did that eventually count toward your overall
Yes, it did.
retirement?
All that time counts. I just wished I could have gotten promoted to make a little bit more money, but they didn't want to do that. But I add to my retirement, and it was a good time. I met a lot of people, met a lot of good people. I only had one, I don't know if you want to call it a bad experience, had one young man, we almost out of time. I had one young man on my second trip back to Fort Bragg. I was on leave, and I was at home, and the phone rang. My wife told the company commander he's not here. Company commander got upset and said, look, tell him to call me as soon as possible. It's an emergency. Well, I didn't know what had happened, so I waited a little bit, and I finally called him, and I said, what's up, Captain? He said, well, so-and-so ran a 5-ton truck through the battalion commander's office. Now, old Fort Bragg was still the old wooden buildings, and a lot of the buildings were the old 2-story wooden things from World War II, to include battalion headquarters. So it wasn't much to go through, those thin walls. They were not real thick walls. In all actuality, his foot slipped off the clutch. But they did a blood test on him, and he came up, he was drunk on duty. He had had a few beers at lunchtime. The Army policy back then was 2 beers at lunchtime. My policy, because we worked on equipment, was no alcohol, and please, don't know if you smoke marijuana or any of that other stuff. Don't do it while on duty, please, because bad things will happen. So talking to the company commander, I put my uniform on, went in, seen the commander, we jumped in his car, drove over to the MP station. The company commander informed this Spec 5, E5, that he was going to be court-martialed for being drunk on duty, as well as marijuana was in his system. And he was, when he worked, he was an excellent guy, good guy, but it totally ruined him. And that was probably the worst part of my military career of having, having to court-martial one of my soldiers over
Having to
something
handle
like
the problem.
that. Yeah. But all the places I'd been, all the jobs I'd done, working in the National Guard, working in the reserves, working in recruiting, I enjoyed every bit of it. I called myself a Cold War warrior, and it was fun times. Yeah, there was bad times. You go to the field and all that stuff. Nobody ever talks about that. It's kind of like the Vietnam or the Korean soldiers or our grandparents. They spoke very little about World War II. They might tell a little funny story or something, but you never hear stories of what went on. And I could go on for a couple hours. Go back to Germany. I was in the 18th Engineer Brigade. We did what we called Graf 82, and there was a Graf 83. Grafenwehr was known by being made by Erwin Rommel, Erwin Rommel, if you know your history, was Germany's World War II tank armor commander. He ran all over the British and the Americans until he started seeing the nonsense of Adolf Hitler's war, and the Germans arrested him and made him commit suicide. But Grafenwehr was his training ground, and it was several thousands of acres, and it hadn't been upgraded. We went in and upgraded that.
What's going to be happening to Grafenwehr in the next few months? You want to go into that?
We can. I have on my computer. I read. There's a website, military.com, which was started by a Navy captain, and they cover things that happen in all branches of the military. Grafenwehr is training Ukrainian soldiers here in 2023. They have their own little community that they've cordoned off on Grafenwehr. It's a huge training area, huge cantonment area where soldiers live and work and sleep when they're up there doing their training.
What German city is Grafenwehr near?
Grafenwehr.
Oh, okay.
It is Grafenwehr.
Is that central Germany or?
Oh no,
or?
it's way up by the East German border. The west side, I guess you want to say.
Okay.
It was about an 8-hour drive at 70, 75 mile an hour from Karlsruhe to Grafenwehr. There was a few times I got lucky enough where I was able to fly. We had a couple of aviation assets where I was able to fly a few times home. But our job was to rebuild all of those ranges. We put mess halls in, we put hard stands in to put tanks on, because you got to think back World War II, that was pretty much the advent of armor, tanks. The biggest shell they fired was a 102 or a 105 round, which is only about that big a round. where the M1, I believe, fires
120.
a 120.
And it's smooth bore, which is
It's
interesting.
smooth bore, yes.
Yeah.
Like quite a bit bigger, and it's a whole lot faster.
Yeah.
So they had to upgrade the ranges, and we did that. And I spent a lot of time up there working on that. It was interesting, and that was Craft 82, 83. I've tried to hope there was something in the computer. I haven't been able to find anything yet. You know, you would think that with the advent of computers and everything you can Google, I couldn't Google that. But
Fred, when did you leave the Army, finally? At the end of your reserve time and recall time and active duty time?
I finally retired in 2010.
I see.
As a recruiter, that was my final thing as a recruiter. I did very well at it. I did not want to go at that time. I wanted to stay one more year. I wanted to get my recruiting ring, and you do that by how many soldiers you put in the Army. The general had put out all retirees will not be extended. So I couldn't extend anymore, and so it was all over with.
They cut the program off.
They cut the program off for us retirees.
Did you go back to civilian employment at that point?
Actually, no. I went home, and with me being at Aberdeen Proving Grounds and meeting the people I did, I'd met some people that were contractors for the military. I contacted them. They put me in touch with an organization called MPRI, Military Professional Resources Incorporated. The Army had started a program in 2010, as a matter of fact. They were training the Afghan Army Corps that was just being stood up in Afghanistan, and they were looking for teams. So I became part of an 8-man team. We were all career soldiers. The lowest rank was an E6. The highest rank we had, our in-country manager was a lieutenant colonel, retired. My team lead at first was a retired sergeant major. Everybody on the team was E7 or E6. And after the E6 left, it was all of us E7s. And I did that for 5 years, training the Afghan Army Corps.
You were in Afghanistan then?
Yes, as a contractor.
Contractor.
I carried no weapon. At first, we even lived with the Afghan soldiers for a short period of time, and somebody thought that wasn't a very good idea, especially when we didn't have weapons, although we were camped out with special forces. And I was in a place called Mazar Sharif, which is on the north part of Afghanistan by Kyrgyzstan, and not too far actually from Iran. And I did that for almost 5 years, late 2010 to July of 2015.
Was this a maintenance job again?
Yes,
you were
I trained the 209th Army Corps. We picked them up in Kabul, Afghanistan, at a camp. We at first taught them how to drive and do a little bit of maintenance to get them from Kabul to Mazar Sharif. We convoyed. I convoyed with them with the German Army. The German Army was mainly in charge of where we were at, not so much the U.S. Army. So I worked very closely with the German Army up there. And it took us a week to convoy. Got attacked twice by the Taliban. And it was interesting to do this. I did forget one thing. I'm going to back up a little bit. When I was recruiting in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, one night I was going to meet a young man and his mom and dad. We always met with mom and dad to make sure everybody was on board. And this is like 7:30 at night. I get a phone call from my wife. My wife informs me my daughter was in the Army at the time. She was in the engineers. She was a truck driver in the engineers. And they were building small operational camps across southern Afghanistan. And their security was done by the Polish Army. And I got a phone call. Her truck had hit a IED, an explosive device, and her vehicle is up armored, but it turned it up on its side. This was her third time being hit, but she was hurt this time. The gunner almost lost his arm. He wound up with microsurgery and all this stuff. He's almost got full use of his arm today. My daughter got TBI, and she has headaches and stuff from that. And I thought, yeah, you know, and I'm driving down the road. My wife is telling me this, and I'm talking on the cell phone, and all of a sudden it hit me. Oh no, my daughter could have been killed. And I had to pull over, because to that point I used my daughter because one of the first questions from mommy or daddy was, and I called all my prospective kids Johnny or Jane, will they go to Afghanistan or Iraq? And I always said yes. Within a year to 18 months, they will be in Iraq or Afghanistan. And as it worked out, I was pretty accurate with that. So I had to be careful then. Now I don't want to tell these people that my daughter just got hurt, because I don't want to tell them that, because then now they're going to be scared. So I never told anybody about my daughter being hurt. The only people that knew were the people in the office and other people on the team, that my daughter had been hurt in Afghanistan. But that does go to tell you that people can get hurt.
I can imagine.
And me, I traveled all over Afghanistan. We went out on convoys. I had been shot at. Never carried a weapon. There was an incident back in the day in Iraq that the Army, the U.S. government, was very leery about contractors carrying weapons. And I guess I understand that, and I don't want to go into that part of it. But stuff happens. I had a good time, and I just hate to see the way things ended. The way they are, being as how it's now 2023, and if you want to go back in history, see what happened prior to January of 2023, and you'll understand. I call it the modern day Vietnam of what happened in Afghanistan.
Well, your daughter made it back home.
Oh yeah, I came home.
Some headaches you mentioned, or some residual issues?
And in fact, she's working with the guys here. She's got, I want to say it's like 80-some% disability. The guys they've figured out that with her migraines that she gets, that's due to the TBI.
Yeah. Traumatic brain injury.
And they're working now to move her disability to 100%. She stayed in the Army for almost 12 years, National Guard. She did 8 years in the Army, the rest in the in the Army Reserve. She was a truck driver.
Was she with the Muskegon unit?
She was with the Muskegon unit, yes. Yeah. And I was...
Transportation company?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was there, I forget the exact title. There is civilian personnel, usually somebody in the unit. And my job was to take all the mothers and fathers of the other kids. If they were to be deployed, I would get a phone call and I would be told, okay, the unit's being deployed and this is what you have to do, Mr. Youngs. Now it's Mr. Youngs. And try to keep the parents satisfied with what answers you're given and where they're going, wherever.
Fred, during your long career here in the Army, did you join any military organizations, either Army organizations or people that had served, or like the Veterans of Foreign Wars or American Legion, anything like that?
Yep. Well, my brother that I was closest to, I had two brothers. One brother was a Navy SEAL and the other was in the Air Force, and he only did his tour and got out, came home. My dad being a truck driver, my older brother that lived close to us, I guess you could say was a de facto dad, because Dad was gone all week long. So I spent a lot of time with my brother, and when I graduated and after I joined the Army, to catch up with him, he worked second shift also. He was a member of the American Legion, and so I joined the American Legion, Post 179 up on Wilson Street, and I was with them for, I don't know, a couple, 3 years. And one day I had moved out by there, and right around the corner from my house, I stumbled across this post by Lamar Park, and it's American Legion Post number 154. I have since been there for 20-some years. My time when I was in the UP, I joined the 40 and 8, and that's an old organization. Used to be a part of the American Legion. They wanted to break off. 40 and 8 goes back to World War II, where you could put 40 men and 8 horses in a World War I rail car. That's where that term comes from. Kind of neat. And we had to dress up in goofy outfits. I had a dress on and a wig, and it was all fun and games. It really was a good time. American Legion, you don't have to do that stuff. Been a member of the American Legion for 25 years now. Been a post historian, junior vice commander, been post commander twice. I am currently the 5th District Commander for American Legion Department of Michigan, which makes me, as the Department of Michigan commander put it, makes all of us district commanders members of the board of directors for Michigan, is the way they wanted us to think about it. So it's like a big business, and it is. There is 56,000 American Legion members in the state of Michigan. 10 years ago, there used to be 120,000. So we're trying to build it back up to the 120,000. There's like 800,000 veterans currently in the state of Michigan, from all the wars that we've been in, from World War II to present. Some, of course, from World War II and Korea are no longer with us. I'm also a member of the NCOA, Non-Commissioned Officers Association, and a member of the Enlisted National Guard Association. And all of those organizations are to help the veterans, and they give the individual a voice. with Congress and the President. So thank you very much. Enjoyed this talk.
Well, thank you, Fred. Yeah, we've been talking with Fred Youngs, retired Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army. My name is Wallace Erickson, as the interviewer and videographer. We certainly appreciate your spending time to give us your recollections here, Fred. This interview has been conducted as part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., and also under the auspices of the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.